The screams echoed through the ravine as Nora Zimmerman stumbled over loose rocks, the fresh wound in her side bleeding through her hastily wrapped bandages. Her younger sister Ellie's hand was clutched tightly in hers as they fled deeper into the wilderness outside of Casa Grande, Arizona, in the summer of 1885. Behind them, distant shouts of angry men carried on the desert breeze, a reminder that their pursuers hadn't given up the chase. I can't go any further," Nora gasped, her knees buckling as she collapsed against a boulder. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the red dust beneath their feet. At 22, she'd always prided herself on her strength, but the knife wound in her side had sapped her energy, leaving her dizzy and weak. "We have to keep moving," 16-year-old Ellie urged, her face streaked with tears and dust. "They'll find us if we don't." Nora pressed her hand against the makeshift bandage wrapped around her midsection. It had been only hours since those men had come to their small homestead, hours since she'd stood between them and her sister, hours since the blade had sliced through her flesh when she refused to let them take Ellie. The memory of their father lying motionless on the floor of their cabin flashed through her mind, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. Just a moment to catch my breath," Nora pleaded, her vision swimming. The wound had stopped bleeding so profusely, but she'd already lost too much blood. Their canteen was nearly empty, and they were miles from town with no horse, no supplies, and no plan beyond escape. Ellie knelt beside her sister, her blonde hair falling in tangles around her face. "You saved my life," she whispered, gently touching Nora's arm, "but I don't know what to do now." The sound of a horse's hooves made them both freeze in terror. Someone was coming. Nora struggled to her feet, pushing Ellie behind her despite the pain that tore through her side. "Run," she hissed. "Find somewhere to hide." "I won't leave you," Ellie insisted, tears streaming down her face. Before they could argue further, a rider appeared around the bend of the ravine. Atop a chestnut mare sat a tall man with broad shoulders, a weathered cowboy hat casting his face in shadow. Nora felt her heart sink. This was it. They'd been found. But as the stranger drew closer, she realized he wasn't one of the men from before. He pulled his horse to a stop several yards away, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You ladies look like you're in a spot of trouble," he said, his voice deep and gentle. His eyes, sharp and blue as a summer sky, took in Nora's blood-soaked shirt and Ellie's terrified expression. "Stay back," Nora warned, her voice weaker than she'd intended. She tried to stand tall, but another wave of dizziness hit her, and she swayed dangerously. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching slowly. "Name's Bryce Xavier," he said, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I'm not looking to cause you any harm. I can see you're hurt, madam. There are men chasing us," Ellie blurted out, ignoring Nora's warning glance. "They killed our father and tried to take me, but Nora fought them off, and now they're hunting us." Bryce's expression hardened. He glanced over his shoulder back the way they'd come. "Stanton's gang," he said, not a question but a statement. "Been terrorizing homesteaders all through this territory." Nora's legs finally gave out and she slid down against the rock. Bryce moved forward quickly, catching her before she hit the ground. The pain in her side flared, and she couldn't hold back a cry of agony. "Let me see," he said firmly, already examining the crude bandage. His hands were calloused but gentle as he carefully peeled back the blood-soaked cloth. He grimaced at what he saw. "This needs proper tending and soon. Why should we trust you?" Nora managed through gritted teeth, even as she leaned against his support. Bryce looked her straight in the eyes. "Because I've been tracking Stanton and his boys for 2 months now. They killed my brother." His jaw tightened. "And because right now I'm your only chance." A distant shout made Ellie gasp in fear. Bryce's head snapped up, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "They're coming," he said quietly. He looked back at Nora, his expression grave but determined. "I'll protect you now, both of you, but we need to move fast." Something in his steady gaze made Nora believe him, or perhaps it was simply that they had no other choice. She nodded weakly. In one smooth motion, Bryce lifted her into his arms, mindful of her injury. My camp is hidden in the foothills about 2 miles from here. We'll be safe there until you're strong enough to travel, my sister. Nora began, reaching for Ellie's hand. She'll ride with us, Bryce assured her, helping Ellie onto his horse before carefully placing Nora in front of her. He took the reins and led the mare away from the ravine, taking a path that would hide their tracks among the rocks. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, away from their pursuers, Nora found herself drifting in and out of consciousness. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was Bryce's voice, low and reassuring. I'll keep you safe, I promise. When Nora next opened her eyes, she was lying beneath a canvas tent, a rough wool blanket covering her. The pain in her side had dulled to a persistent throb, and her clothes had been changed. She now wore a man's shirt that was far too large for her frame. Panic flared briefly until she heard Ellie's voice nearby, talking softly with their rescuer. She's been alone since our ma died 5 years back, Ellie was saying. Raised me herself, practically. Pa wasn't much help, always drinking away what little money we had. That couldn't have been easy, came Bryce's deep voice in response. Nora never complained. She's the strongest person I know. Nora tried to sit up but gasped as pain shot through her side. Immediately the tent flap pushed aside and Ellie rushed to her, followed by Bryce. You're awake, Ellie exclaimed, kneeling beside her. Thank goodness, you've been out for nearly a day. A day. Nora's voice was raspy with thirst. Bryce handed her a canteen and she drank gratefully. You lost a lot of blood, he explained, kneeling to check her bandages. Fresh white cloth had replaced her makeshift dressing. The cut was deep but clean. I stitched it up best I could. Nora's cheeks flushed as she realized the implications. I was a field medic during the war, he said matter-of-factly. Seen worse wounds than yours. Ellie helped with the changing of your clothes. Your modesty's intact, Miss Zimmerman. Despite the gravity of their situation, Nora found herself strangely comforted by his straightforward manner. Now, in the soft light filtering through the canvas, she could see him properly for the first time. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or 31, with sun-weathered skin and the beginning of crow's feet around his eyes. His dark hair was cropped short, and a neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw. Thank you, she said simply, for helping us, for saving my sister. Bryce nodded once, his expression solemn. No man worth his salt would have done different. He checked her forehead for fever. You're healing well, but you need rest. Once you're stronger, we'll figure out what comes next. What about those men? Nora asked, tension returning to her body. Stanton's gang, you called them? They won't find us here, Bryce assured her. This camp is well hidden and I've covered our tracks, been using this spot for weeks while tracking them. You're after them alone? Ellie asked, wide-eyed. A shadow crossed Bryce's face. The law in these parts is spread too thin. Marshall in Casa Grande has his hands full with the railroad coming through. No one's going to chase down Stanton but me. For your brother, Nora said softly. Bryce nodded, his jaw tight. James, he had a small ranch near the Gila River. Good man. Had a wife expecting their first child. He stood abruptly. I'll get some food started. You need to eat to regain your strength. As he ducked out of the tent, Ellie squeezed Nora's hand. He saved your life, she whispered. He knew exactly what to do for your wound. Nora nodded slowly. He seems honorable, he is, Ellie confirmed. While you were unconscious, he never once, he was a perfect gentleman, even made me sleep in here with you while he stayed outside. Nora felt something inside her ease a little. In a world that had just turned unimaginably cruel, finding someone genuinely good seemed almost miraculous. Over the next 3 days, Nora gradually regained her strength. Bryce proved to be not only skilled at treating her wound but also a surprisingly good camp cook. He made hearty stews from jackrabbit and the provisions he had stored, supplemented with wild onions and desert herbs he gathered each morning. On the 4th morning, Nora ventured outside the tent for the first time, leaning heavily on Ellie's arm. Their camp was nestled in a small canyon, invisible from below and shielded by twisted juniper trees. A clear spring bubbled from the rocks nearby, explaining why Bryce had chosen this location. "Good to see you up," Bryce said, looking up from where he was cleaning his rifle. "How's the pain?" "Manageable," Nora replied, carefully lowering herself onto a flat rock. The desert stretched out below them, beautiful and deadly in its vastness. "What happens now?" Bryce set his rifle aside and came to sit opposite her. "That depends. Do you have family you can go to?" Nora shook her head. "Our mother's sister lives in Denver, but we haven't spoken in years. I'm not even sure she'd take us in." "What about friends in Casa Grande? We kept to ourselves mostly," Ellie said. "Pa didn't like us socializing." Bryce frowned, clearly weighing their limited options. "The safest thing would be to get you far away from Arizona territory until Stanton's dealt with. Maybe put you on a train east." "With what money?" Nora asked pragmatically. "Everything we had was in that cabin." "I have some saved," Bryce offered. "Enough to get you to Colorado at least." Nora straightened, wincing at the pull on her stitches. "We won't take your money, Mr. Xavier." "Bryce," he corrected automatically, "and it's not charity, it's the right thing to do." "So is paying our debts," Nora insisted. "We already owe you our lives, I won't add to that debt." A hint of admiration flickered in Bryce's eyes. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but without heat. "Fine, then we need another plan." They fell silent, each lost in thought. Finally, Ellie spoke up. "What if we help you?" "Help me what?" Bryce asked, puzzled. "Catch Stanton." "Get justice for your brother and our father." Bryce was already shaking his head. "Absolutely not, it's too dangerous." "We know what they look like," Ellie persisted. "We could identify them." "Ellie," Nora cautioned, but her sister continued, "and they wouldn't expect women to be involved." "We could be, I don't know, a distraction or something." "No," Bryce and Nora said simultaneously. "It was just an idea," Ellie mumbled, clearly disappointed. Bryce ran a hand through his hair. "Look, the safest thing would be for you two to stay hidden while I continue tracking Stanton. Once I've dealt with him, you can decide what comes next." "And how long will that take?" Nora challenged. "Weeks, months. We can't just hide in the wilderness indefinitely." "Better than being dead," Bryce countered bluntly. Nora flinched at his words, and immediately his expression softened. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was harsh, but those men won't hesitate to kill you both if they find you. They've done it before." "They killed our father," Nora said quietly. "We can't just do nothing." Bryce studied her for a long moment. "I understand vengeance, believe me. But getting yourself killed won't bring him back." "It's not about vengeance," Nora insisted. "It's about justice, and about being able to live without looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." The conviction in her voice seemed to resonate with Bryce. He nodded slowly. "All right. Let me think on it. There might be a way to keep you safe while still bringing Stanton to justice. But first, you need to heal completely." That night, as Ellie slept soundly in the tent, Nora found herself unable to rest. The pain in her side had subsided enough that she could move around more freely, and the night air called to her. She carefully made her way outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the desert chill. Bryce sat by the small, carefully banked fire, his profile outlined in the soft glow of the embers. He looked up as she approached but didn't seem surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. Nora shook her head, easing herself down beside him. "Too much on my mind." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the desert surrounding them, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. "Tell me about your brother," Nora finally said. Bryce's hands stilled where they'd been absently whittling a piece of wood. "James was 4 years younger than me, always the better of us, kinder, more patient, saw the good in everyone." A sad smile touched his lips. "Even during the war, he never lost that. While I grew hard, he somehow stayed." "Human, you fought together?" Bryce nodded. "Union Army. I was 20 when we joined up. He was just 16, lied about his age. Our parents had died in a flood the year before, so there was no one to stop him following me." "Like me and Ellie," Nora said softly. I see that in you, Bryce agreed. The way you protect her, put yourself between her and danger without thinking twice. His eyes dropped to her side where her wound was hidden beneath her clothes. It's admirable. It's what anyone would do for family. No, Bryce said, his voice tinged with bitterness. Not everyone. Plenty of men abandoned their families during the war. Plenty more came home and treated them worse than strangers. Nora considered this. Your brother's wife, what happened to her? Sarah. Bryce's voice softened on the name. She lost the baby after James was killed. Grief, the doctor said. She's back east now with her parents. I'm sorry. So am I. He tossed his whittling into the fire, watching as it caught and burned. I was there the day it happened, you know, at James's ranch. I'd stopped by on my way back from Tucson. Found Stanton and his men ransacking the place. James tried to stop them from taking his horses. He fell silent, lost in painful memory. Nora didn't press him to continue, understanding all too well the weight of witnessing a loved one's murder. I was shot too, Bryce finally said. Took a bullet in the shoulder. By the time I came to, they were gone. James was dead, and I swore I wouldn't rest until I'd brought every last one of them to justice. How many have you caught so far? Nora asked. 2, Bryce replied grimly. Left them tied up outside the marshal's office in Tucson with evidence of their crimes. Stanton and 3 others are still out there, including the men who attacked us. Bryce nodded. From your description, it sounds like Stanton himself was there, along with his right-hand man, Ned Holloway. The third was probably Tom Rigby, mean as a rattlesnake that one. Nora shivered, remembering the cold eyes of the man who'd driven a knife into her side. That sounds right. They're headed for the border, I expect. They've got a hideout somewhere in the mountains near Mexico. That's where I've been tracking them to. Nora stared into the dying embers, an idea forming. What if we didn't hide? What if we used ourselves as bait? Bryce's head snapped up. No, absolutely not. Hear me out, Nora insisted. They know Ellie and I escaped. They'll be looking for us, worried we'll identify them to the law. What if we made it known we were in a certain place, somewhere we could control the situation? That's exactly what your sister suggested, and it's still a terrible idea. Not if we plan it carefully, Nora argued. Not if we have the advantage of surprise. Bryce studied her face, his expression a mixture of admiration and exasperation. You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've ever met, Nora Zimmerman. Probably both, she admitted with a small smile. Despite himself, Bryce chuckled. Get some rest. We can talk more about this tomorrow, though I'm still inclined to say no. Nora nodded, rising carefully to her feet. Before she turned to go, she placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. Thank you, Bryce, not just for saving us, but for understanding. He covered her hand with his own just for a moment. Get some sleep, Nora. As she made her way back to the tent, Nora found herself acutely aware of the warmth his touch had left on her skin and the strange, fluttering sensation it caused in her chest. It was an unexpected feeling, one she had no time or right to indulge. And yet, as she lay down beside her sleeping sister, she couldn't help but wonder about the quiet strength of the man who had promised to protect them. Over the next week, Nora's wound continued to heal, and her strength returned. Each day, she pushed herself a little further, walking around the camp, helping prepare meals, even learning how to shoot the spare revolver Bryce kept in his saddlebags. He proved to be a patient teacher, adjusting her grip and stance with gentle corrections. You're a natural, he commented one afternoon as she hit the makeshift target for the 3rd time in a row. Good eye. My father taught me the basics when I was younger, Nora explained. Before the drinking took over. He was a good man once, long ago. Bryce nodded, understanding in his eyes. War changes men, not always for the better. Was he a soldier? Ellie asked, watching them from where she sat mending one of Nora's torn shirts. Fought for the Confederacy, Nora confirmed. He never spoke of it, but sometimes he'd wake screaming in the night. Ma said he came back different. Many did, Bryce said quietly. He checked the cylinder of his own revolver before holstering it. I was lucky to have James. He kept me anchored when I might have lost myself. And now, Nora asked, meeting his eyes, a corner of his mouth lifted in a wry half-smile. Now I've got my purpose, that's enough. Is it? She challenged gently. Before he could answer, the distant sound of horses made them all freeze. Bryce motioned for silence, drawing his weapon as he moved to the edge of the outcropping where they could look down on the trail below. 3 riders were making their way slowly through the canyon, their posture alert and watchful. Even from a distance, Nora recognized them immediately, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "Stanton," Bryce whispered, confirming her fear. "They must be sweeping the area looking for signs of you." "How did they know to search here?" Ellie whispered, her face pale with fear. "They're thorough," Bryce replied grimly. "And they know the territory. Stay low and quiet. They can't see the camp from the trail." They watched in tense silence as the 3 men continued their slow progress through the canyon. At one point, the leader, Stanton himself, a tall man with a shock of white blonde hair, dismounted to examine something on the ground. Nora held her breath, fearing he'd found some sign of their presence. But after a moment, he remounted and the group continued on. Only when they had disappeared around the bend did Bryce relax slightly. "They're headed southwest, toward the border like I thought." "They're still looking for us," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. Bryce nodded grimly. "And they won't stop. Stanton doesn't leave loose ends." He turned to face them both. "We need to move camp. They might circle back, be more thorough in their search." "Where will we go?" Ellie asked, clutching Nora's arm. "I know a place," Bryce said after a moment's thought. "An old line shack about 15 miles from here. It's isolated but defendable if it comes to that." "When do we leave?" Nora asked. "Tomorrow at first light. We'll travel light, take only what we need." That night, as they packed what few possessions they had, Nora found herself watching Bryce as he methodically cleaned his weapons and organized supplies. There was something comforting in his calm efficiency, in the way he anticipated problems before they arose. "You've done this before," she observed. "Running, I mean," Bryce glanced up at her. "Not running, hunting, there's a difference." "Is there?" Nora challenged. "Because from where I'm standing we're the ones being hunted." Bryce set down the knife he'd been sharpening. "Not for long," he said, his voice hardening. "I've been tracking Stanton for months. I'm close now, closer than I've ever been." "Because of us," Nora realized. "They've changed their pattern to look for us." "Yes," Bryce admitted, "which is why I'm thinking your plan might have merit after all." Nora's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You said it was foolhardy." "It is," he agreed with a slight smile, "but sometimes foolhardy is all we've got." "You're considering using us as bait?" Ellie asked, her voice rising in excitement rather than fear. "Not exactly," Bryce cautioned. "But we might be able to use Stanton's interest in finding you to our advantage." He spread a rough map on the ground between them. "The line shack is here, near Walker Creek. It's isolated enough that we'd see anyone approaching, but close enough to Casa Grande that we could get help if needed." "What's your plan?" Nora asked, studying the map. "We get settled at the shack. Then I spread word in town that 2 women matching your description have been seen in the area. Stanton will hear about it. He'll have informants watching for such news." "Then what?" Ellie pressed. "Then we prepare a welcome for them," Bryce said grimly. "On our terms." "The marshal won't help?" Nora asked. Bryce's expression darkened. "Marshal Pettit is compromised. He looks the other way when it comes to Stanton. There's money changing hands, I'm sure of it." "So it's just us against 3 armed killers," Nora summarized. "I've faced worse odds," Bryce said simply. "We'll help," Nora insisted. "I'm a decent shot, as you've seen, and Ellie is quick and observant." "I don't like involving you," Bryce admitted, "but I also don't see any better options. If we run, they'll keep hunting. If we go to the law, they'll be warned." "Then it's decided," Nora said firmly. "We fight." Early the next morning they broke camp, carefully removing any trace of their presence. Bryce had Nora ride his horse with Ellie, while he led them on foot through the rugged terrain, choosing paths that would be difficult to track. By midday, the summer sun was beating down mercilessly, but they pushed on, stopping only briefly to rest in the shade of a rock outcropping. "How's your side?" Bryce asked, offering Nora the canteen. "Sore, but holding up," she replied honestly. The wound pulled with each movement of the horse, but the stitches were holding firm. "We're making good time," he assured her. "Another few hours and we'll reach the shack." As he helped Ellie remount, his hands steady and sure, Nora found herself studying him with new eyes. There was more to Bryce Xavier than the grim determination that drove his hunt for Stanton. She'd seen glimpses of it in the way he patiently taught Ellie to build a proper fire, in the gentle care he'd shown tending Nora's wound, in the rare moments when he let his guard down enough to share stories of his brother or his time as a cavalry scout after the war. He was a man shaped by loss and duty, but not consumed by it. And despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the grief still fresh from their father's murder, Nora was beginning to feel something stir within her whenever Bryce was near. Something unexpected and probably unwise. They reached the line shack just as dusk was falling. It was a simple structure, built of rough-hewn logs with a sloped roof and a single window beside the door. A lean-to at the back served as a stable for Bryce's horse. Inside was sparse but clean: a stone fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. "It's not much," Bryce apologized, lighting a lantern, "but it's solid and the location gives us good visibility in all directions." "It's perfect," Nora assured him, sinking gratefully onto one of the chairs. The ride had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. Ellie immediately began exploring the small space, her natural resilience allowing her to find excitement even in their dire circumstances. "Look, Nora, there are books," she exclaimed, discovering a small shelf of volumes tucked beside the fireplace. Bryce smiled at her enthusiasm. "Previous occupant must have been a reader. Make yourself at home with them." While Ellie eagerly examined the books, Bryce turned to Nora. "Let me check your wound," he said quietly. "That was a long ride for someone still healing." Nora nodded, too tired to object to his concern. She carefully lifted the edge of her shirt, revealing the bandaged area on her side. Bryce knelt beside her, his touch clinical and gentle as he examined the stitches. "No fresh bleeding," he noted with approval. "You're tougher than you look, Nora Zimmerman." "I've had to be," she replied simply. Something in her tone made him look up, their faces suddenly close. For a moment neither spoke, caught in an unexpected awareness of each other. Then Bryce cleared his throat, standing and moving to fetch fresh bandages from his pack. "I'll head into town tomorrow," he said, his voice deliberately neutral. "Get supplies, spread the word about 2 women being spotted in the area. With luck, it'll reach Stanton's ears by nightfall." "How long do you think before they come?" Ellie asked, looking up from a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans. 2 days, maybe 3, Bryce estimated. "They won't rush in blind, they'll scout the area first. And we'll be ready," Nora said with more confidence than she felt. Bryce gave her an appraising look. "Yes, we will." That night, Bryce insisted on sleeping outside, giving the small cot to Ellie while Nora took his bedroll on the floor near the fireplace. Despite her exhaustion, Nora found sleep elusive. The events of the past days kept playing through her mind: her father's murder, her own near death, the unexpected salvation in the form of a solitary cowboy with haunted eyes and gentle hands. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and quietly made her way outside. Bryce was sitting with his back against a pine tree, his rifle across his knees, watching the moonlit landscape. He didn't seem surprised when she settled beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. "Too much thinking," she admitted. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the desert a soothing backdrop. "Tell me something, Bryce," Nora finally said. "What will you do after? If we succeed, I mean, if Stanton and his men are caught." Bryce seemed taken aback by the question. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he confessed. "For 2 years, this hunt has been my only purpose. But before, what did you want from life before your brother was killed?" He considered this, his profile strong in the moonlight. "I had a small spread near Flagstaff." Nothing fancy, just enough land for a few cattle and a decent garden. I sold it to finance this hunt." "You were a rancher." "Trying to be," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I wasn't particularly good at it yet, but I liked the quiet, the honest work of it. Would you go back to it?" "If you could." Bryce was silent for a long moment. "Maybe, with the right reasons." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did you want before all this?" Nora hugged her knees to her chest. "I never had the luxury of wanting much," she said honestly. "After Ma died, it was all about surviving, keeping Ellie fed and clothed, trying to hold what little we had together." "You never thought of marriage, a family of your own?" A soft, sad laugh escaped her. "There weren't exactly suitors lining up for the daughter of a drunk, Mr. Xavier." "And even if there had been?" She trailed off, not wanting to admit how terrified she'd been of choosing wrong, of ending up with a man like her father had become. Bryce seemed to understand what she didn't say. "You deserved better choices," he said quietly. The simple acknowledgement nearly undid her. Nora found herself blinking back unexpected tears. "Perhaps after all this, both of us might find new purposes," she suggested, her voice slightly unsteady. "Perhaps," Bryce agreed, his eyes holding hers for a moment too long to be casual. Then he looked away, back to the moonlit landscape. "You should try to sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." Nora nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, she leaned her head against the tree trunk, letting the night sounds wash over her. Eventually, her eyes grew heavy and she drifted off, vaguely aware of Bryce placing his jacket over her shoulders as sleep claimed her. The next morning, Bryce rode out for Casa Grande as planned, leaving the sisters with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the door barred. He'd shown them where extra ammunition was hidden and made sure both knew how to reload the revolver he left with them. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "If anyone approaches that isn't me, hide in the root cellar under the floor." He'd shown them the trapdoor the previous night, a small space dug beneath the cabin that had once been used to store vegetables. Once he was gone, the hours stretched endlessly. Nora busied herself reinforcing the shutters and preparing the cabin for what might come, while Ellie kept watch from the window, her young face uncharacteristically solemn. "Do you think this will work?" Ellie asked, watching the empty trail that led to their temporary refuge. "It has to," Nora replied simply. There were no other options left to them. "I'm scared," Ellie admitted in a small voice, "but I'm trying not to be." Nora crossed the small space to hug her sister. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means doing what needs doing despite the fear." "Like you did when you stood between me and those men," Nora nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her healing wound. "I wasn't thinking clearly then, just reacting, but yes, I suppose so. Bryce is brave too," Ellie observed, "but in a different way, quieter." "Yes," Nora agreed softly. "He is. You like him," Ellie said, not a question but a statement. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He saved our lives. Of course I'm grateful, not just grateful," Ellie interrupted with surprising insight. "I see how you look at him when you think no one's watching." "And how he looks at you." "Ellie, this isn't the time. When is the time then?" her sister challenged. "We might die tomorrow or the next day. Shouldn't we at least be honest about how we feel while we can?" The wisdom in the young girl's words struck Nora silent. When had Ellie grown so perceptive, so mature? "It's complicated," Nora finally said. "We've known him barely 2 weeks, and we're in the middle of a dangerous situation." "Life is complicated," Ellie countered. "Pa always said that was just an excuse people use when they're scared." "Since when do you quote Pa's wisdom?" Nora asked, deflecting. "Since he occasionally said something true," Ellie replied with a small smile. Then, more seriously, "I just don't want you to miss something good because you're too busy protecting everyone else to think about what you want." Before Nora could form a response, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense. Ellie peered cautiously out the window. "It's Bryce," she reported with relief. Nora unbarred the door, watching as he dismounted, laden with supplies. The afternoon sun caught in his dark hair, and for a moment, she allowed herself to see him as simply a man strong, capable, with a quiet dignity that spoke of deep character. And yes, if she were honest with herself, a man she was beginning to care for in ways that went beyond mere gratitude. "Everything all right?" he asked as he approached, ever vigilant. "All quiet," she assured him, taking some of the packages from his arms. "Any news from town?" Bryce nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. "Word is spreading. I mentioned to the storekeeper that I'd seen 2 women matching your descriptions staying at an abandoned homestead near Walker Creek." "Not here," Nora asked, confused. "Misdirection," Bryce explained. "The homestead is about 3 miles south. If Stanton sends scouts, they'll check there first. Meanwhile, we'll be watching, ready to move when we need to." "You're using the homestead as bait, not us," Nora realized. Bryce nodded. "I won't risk your safety more than necessary. This way, we control the situation better." "Smart," Ellie approved, helping to unpack the provisions he'd brought: flour, coffee, jerky, ammunition, and even a few apples as a treat. "What else did you learn in town?" Nora asked, noting the troubled look that flashed across Bryce's face despite his outward calm. "Stanton and his men were seen yesterday at a ranch about 10 miles from here," he said quietly. "They killed the rancher and his son, took their horses and supplies." Nora's blood ran cold. "They're still killing. And they're closer than I'd hoped," Bryce confirmed. "We need to be ready by tomorrow. I don't think we'll have longer than that." The grim reality of their situation settled over them. That night, as they ate a simple meal of cornbread and beans, Bryce went over the plan again, making sure both women understood exactly what to do when not if Stanton's gang arrived. "The moment we spot them approaching, you 2 hide in the root cellar," he instructed. "I'll deal with them." "Alone," Nora challenged. "Against 3 armed men, that's suicide, Bryce." "I'll have the advantage of surprise," he countered, "and I'm a better shot than any of them." "So am I," Nora insisted. "You've seen me practice, I can help." Bryce's jaw tightened stubbornly. "I won't put you at risk." "We're already at risk," Nora pointed out. "And I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you how it's going to be. I won't hide while you face them alone." They stared at each other across the table, neither willing to back down. Finally, Ellie broke the tense silence. What if Nora positioned herself by the window? She could provide covering fire while staying relatively protected. Bryce and Nora both turned to look at her in surprise. "What?" Ellie shrugged. "I've been reading that book about frontier warfare. The principles seem sound." Despite the gravity of their situation, Bryce let out a short laugh. "Your sister is full of surprises," he said to Nora. "You have no idea," Nora replied dryly, "but she has a point." Bryce considered it, clearly still reluctant but recognizing the logic. "All right," he finally conceded. "But at the first sign the plan is failing, you both get to that root cellar. Promise me that." "I promise," Nora agreed, relief flooding her that he wasn't shutting her out completely. "I'll stay in the cellar from the start," Ellie offered. "I know I'm not as good a shot, and I'd just be in the way." Bryce reached across the table to squeeze the girl's hand briefly. "You're never in the way, Ellie, but thank you for understanding." That night, as they prepared for what might come with the dawn, Nora found herself watching Bryce as he methodically checked and rechecked their weapons. His hands were steady, his movements precise. A man prepared to do what was necessary, however grim. "You should try to sleep," he said without looking up, somehow sensing her observation. "So should you," he shook his head. "I'll keep watch, you'll need your strength tomorrow." "So will you," she countered, coming to sit beside him at the table. "We could take shifts." Bryce finally looked at her, a small smile touching his lips. "Always arguing with me." "Someone needs to," Nora replied with an answering smile. A comfortable silence fell between them as Bryce resumed his work, Nora watching the sure movements of his hands. "I meant what I said earlier," she said quietly. "About not hiding while you face danger alone. I won't do it." Bryce set down the revolver he'd been cleaning. "It's not about doubting your courage or your ability, Nora. It's about—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "About what?" He met her eyes directly. "About not being able to bear the thought of you being hurt again, or worse." The raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "Why?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I think you know," he said softly. Nora's heart hammered in her chest as she reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching his. "Say it anyway." Bryce turned his hand to capture hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Because in the short time I've known you, Nora Zimmerman, you've become important to me. More important than I could have imagined possible, despite the circumstances, or because of them. Does it matter? Perhaps not," she conceded. "But I'd like to believe what we both seem to feel would exist regardless of how we met. What do you feel?" Bryce asked, his voice low. Instead of answering with words, Nora leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss. For a moment he remained still, as if surprised. Then his hand came up to cradle the back of her head, deepening the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally pulled apart, Bryce rested his forehead against hers. "We could both die tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All the more reason not to wait to acknowledge what's between us," she replied. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "When this is over, if we both survive, I want a chance to court you properly. Not in the midst of danger and revenge, but in the light of day with time to learn each other truly." Nora smiled, hope blossoming within her for the first time since her father's murder. "I'd like that very much." They stayed talking late into the night, sharing pieces of themselves that had nothing to do with the danger they faced, childhood memories, dreams deferred, small joys that had sustained them through difficult times. And when Nora finally slept, it was with Bryce's promise to wake her for the second watch, though she suspected he'd let her sleep through the night. Dawn broke clear and crisp, the September air carrying the first hint of autumn's approach. Nora woke to find Bryce already up, coffee brewing on the small stove. As she'd expected, he'd let her sleep through the night. "You were supposed to wake me," she chided, accepting the tin cup he offered. "You needed the rest more than I needed sleep," he replied simply. He looked tired but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape visible through the window. "Anything?" she asked, joining him in his vigilance. He shook his head. "Not yet, but they'll come." Ellie emerged from the cot, her hair mussed with sleep but her eyes clear and focused. Despite her youth, she showed remarkable composure, helping prepare a simple breakfast without complaint or excessive chatter. By mid-morning, the waiting had become almost unbearable. Nora found herself jumping at every sound: a bird taking flight, the wind rustling through pine needles, the natural settling of the cabin's timbers. "How can you be so calm?" she finally asked Bryce, who had been methodically carving notches into wooden plugs he'd fashioned to fill the gaps between logs where the cabin's chinking had deteriorated. "Practice," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Spent a lot of time waiting during the war, scouting missions mostly. You learn patience or you go mad." "I think I prefer action," Nora admitted. "Most people do," Bryce agreed. "That's why patience gives you the advantage. The impatient make mistakes." It was just after noon when Bryce suddenly stiffened, his head turning slightly as he listened. Nora hadn't heard anything, but she trusted his instincts immediately. "Riders," he said quietly. "At least 2 coming from the south." Ellie's eyes widened in fear, but she moved with purpose, gathering the few personal items they'd left out and tucking them away as they'd practiced. "It might not be them," Nora said, but without much conviction. "It might not," Bryce acknowledged, "but we proceed as if it is." He checked his rifle once more, then moved to the window, careful to stay back from the glass. "Take your position, Nora. Ellie to the cellar now." Ellie hugged her sister fiercely before descending into the small space beneath the floor. Bryce secured the trapdoor, covering it with a small rug they'd found in the cabin. Nora took her place at the side window, the revolver heavy in her hand. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady, her mind clear. Whatever came, she would face it alongside Bryce. 3 riders, Bryce confirmed after a moment, moving cautiously. "It's them." Nora drew a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "What's the plan?" "We let them approach." Let them think they have surprise on their side. When they're close enough, I'll step outside. You cover me from here. And if things go wrong, Bryce met her eyes briefly, then you get to that cellar with Ellie and you run at the first opportunity. There's a horse hidden in the stand of pines behind the cabin. Take it and don't look back. I won't leave you, Nora insisted. You will if it means saving your sister and yourself, Bryce countered firmly. Promise me, Nora. The intensity in his gaze broke no argument. I promise, she said, knowing even as the words left her mouth that it was a promise she might not be able to keep. They fell silent as the riders drew closer. From her vantage point, Nora could now make them out clearly 3 men, dusty from the trail, their faces set in hard lines. The leader, a tall man with pale hair, was unmistakably Stanton. Beside him rode the man who had stabbed her, his face seared into her memory. They're splitting up, Bryce murmured. Stanton and Holloway approaching the front, Rigby circling around back. I'll watch the rear window, Nora said, already moving to cover that approach. Bryce caught her arm. No, stay here. I'll deal with Rigby first. Before she could protest, he slipped silently to the back of the cabin, disappearing into the shadows. Nora returned her attention to the front, watching as Stanton and his companion dismounted, approaching the cabin with weapons drawn. Her throat tightened with fear and rage at the sight of them, these men who had murdered her father, who had tried to take her sister, who had left countless others dead in their wake. Her finger tightened on the trigger of the revolver, but she held steady, trusting Bryce's plan. A muffled sound from outside caught her attention, the brief struggle of a man taken by surprise. One down, she thought grimly, hoping it was Rigby. The sound alerted Stanton as well. He gestured sharply to Holloway, sending him toward the side of the cabin while he approached the front door directly. Nora tensed, waiting for Bryce's next move. It came moments later, a single, clean shot that dropped Holloway where he stood. Stanton immediately dove for cover behind a water barrel at the corner of the porch. Xavier, he shouted. I know it's you, show yourself. Bryce reappeared at the front of the cabin, his rifle trained on Stanton's position. It's over, Stanton, he called. Rigby and Holloway are down. You're alone. Never thought you'd use women as bait, Stanton called back, his voice carrying a mocking edge. Not your style. They're not bait, Bryce replied coldly. They're survivors, witnesses to your crimes. A harsh laugh came from behind the barrel. Witnesses need to be alive to testify, and once I'm done with you, they won't be. Nora saw Stanton shift position slightly, aiming his pistol toward where Bryce stood. Without hesitation, she fired through the window, the shot splintering the wood of the barrel inches from Stanton's head. Stanton cursed, ducking lower. Got yourself a little help, I see. More than a little, Bryce replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Surrender, Stanton, you can't win this. I always win, Stanton snarled, suddenly rolling from his cover and firing rapidly at Bryce. Nora watched in horror as Bryce jerked backward, blood blossoming on his left shoulder. But he remained standing, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Stanton staggered as a bullet caught him in the chest, but incredibly he stayed on his feet, raising his pistol for another shot. Without thinking, Nora burst from the cabin, firing as she moved. Her first shot went wide, but her second caught Stanton in the arm, causing him to drop his weapon. He lunged for it with his good hand, but Bryce was faster, delivering a final shot that sent Stanton sprawling in the dust, motionless. The sudden silence was deafening. Nora rushed to Bryce's side, her eyes frantically assessing his wound. How bad? I'll live, he grunted, though his face was pale with pain. Check Stanton, make sure he's dead. Nora approached the fallen outlaw cautiously, revolver still trained on him. There was no need for caution. Stanton's sightless eyes stared at the sky, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. He's gone, she confirmed, turning back to Bryce. Let me see that shoulder. Rigby first, Bryce insisted. He's unconscious behind the cabin, need to secure him before he comes to. Together, they bound the unconscious Rigby tightly with rope from the stable. Only then did Nora help Bryce inside, calling for Ellie to emerge from the cellar. Ellie gasped at the sight of Bryce's bloodied shirt, but quickly recovered, fetching water and clean cloth without being asked. With gentle efficiency, Nora cleaned and bandaged the wound, relieved to find the bullet had passed cleanly through muscle without hitting bone. "You were lucky," she told him, securing the bandage. "Skilled," he corrected with a wan smile. "I saw him aiming and moved, just not quite fast enough." "What now?" Ellie asked, looking from one to the other. Bryce grimaced as he tested his injured shoulder. "Now we deliver Rigby to the proper authorities, not in Casa Grande but in Tucson. There's a federal marshal there who can't be bought. And then," Nora pressed softly. Bryce's eyes met hers, warm with promise despite the pain he must be feeling. "And then, Miss Zimmerman, I believe I mentioned something about courting you properly." A smile bloomed on Nora's face. "I believe you did, Mr. Xavier. You're really staying together." Ellie asked, hope clear in her voice. "If your sister will have me," Bryce replied, his gaze never leaving Nora's face. "I think that can be arranged," Nora said, her heart lighter than it had been in years, despite the danger they'd just faced. "After all, you did promise to protect us." "A promise I intend to keep," Bryce assured her, reaching out to take her hand. "For as long as you'll let me." 2 days later, they rode into Tucson with Rigby bound and gagged across a spare horse. The evidence they presented to Federal Marshal Collins, including detailed accounts from both Nora and Ellie about the attack on their homestead, was enough to ensure that Rigby would hang for his crimes. "You've done the territory a service," Collins told them after taking their statements. "Stanton's gang has been terrorizing honest folk for too long." "Will the corruption in Casa Grande be investigated?" Bryce asked, his arm still in a sling but healing well under Nora's attentive care. Collins nodded grimly. "Already have men looking into Marshal Pettit's sudden wealth. Justice may be slow, but it comes eventually." With Rigby in custody and their statements given, the three found themselves at a crossroads literally and figuratively as they stood on Tucson's Main Street discussing their future. "I could wire my aunt in Denver," Nora suggested hesitantly. "Though I don't know if she'd welcome us." "Or," Bryce said, "there's a small ranch for sale about 20 miles north of here, nothing fancy but good water and decent grazing. I looked into it while you were giving your statements." Nora's heart skipped. "You want to buy a ranch here in Arizona?" Bryce nodded, suddenly looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I know it's fast, too fast probably, but these past weeks have shown me what's important, what I want for my future." His eyes held hers steadily. "And that's you, Nora, you and Ellie if you'll have me." "Are you proposing Bryce Xavier?" Nora asked, breathless. "Not yet," he said with a small smile. "I meant what I said about courting you properly, but I am asking if you'd consider staying, building something together. Say yes," Ellie urged, practically bouncing with excitement. "Please, Nora." Nora laughed, joy bubbling up inside her despite all the grief and danger they'd endured. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to staying. Yes to building something together." The smile that broke across Bryce's face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then let's go see about that ranch," he said, offering her his good arm. 3 months later, on a clear December morning, Nora stood in the small parlor of their new home, hardly believing how much her life had changed. The ranch Bryce had purchased was modest, but sound a solid house with 3 bedrooms, a barn, corral, and enough land to run a small herd of cattle. With Bryce's knowledge and Nora's determination, they'd made impressive progress in a short time. Ellie had blossomed in their new life, taking to ranch work with enthusiasm and showing a particular gift with the horses. She'd also begun attending the small school in the nearby settlement, making friends and excelling in her studies. And Nora and Bryce. Their courtship had been as proper as circumstances allowed, though living under the same roof had raised a few eyebrows in town. But Nora cared little for gossip. What mattered was the deep bond that had grown between them, a partnership of equals forged in adversity and strengthened by shared purpose and deepening love. Today would mark another new beginning. Nora smoothed the front of her new dress, a simple creation of pale blue cotton, the nicest she'd ever owned, and secured the last pin in her upswept hair. From the main room came the sound of quiet conversation as the few guests they'd invited gathered for the small ceremony. A knock at the bedroom door was followed by Ellie's excited face peering in. "Are you ready? The preacher's here and Bryce is looking so handsome you won't believe it." Nora smiled at her sister's enthusiasm. "I'm ready." Ellie entered fully, carrying a small bouquet of winter flowers. "Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile brought these for you." "Isn't that kind?" "Very kind," Nora agreed, accepting the bouquet. In their short time here, they'd made friends, good people who had welcomed them without prying too deeply into their past. Ellie suddenly grew serious. "Are you happy, Nora?" "Truly, happier than I ever imagined possible," Nora answered honestly. "Are you?" Ellie nodded emphatically. "I love it here. I love our new life and Bryce." She grinned. "He's perfect for you, even if he does snore," Nora laughed. "Don't let him hear you say that." She took a deep breath, smoothing her skirts one final time. "Shall we?" The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. Standing before the small gathering of neighbors and new friends, with Ellie beaming beside her, Nora pledged her life and love to Bryce Xavier. His hands were steady as he placed the simple gold band on her finger, his eyes never leaving hers as he spoke his vows. "I promise to protect you, to honor you, and to love you all the days of my life," he said, his voice clear and sure. "You found me when I was lost in darkness, Nora. You brought me back to life. And you saved mine," she replied softly, "in more ways than you know." Later, as their guests enjoyed the wedding feast prepared by the neighboring women, Bryce led Nora out onto the porch of their home. The winter sun was setting, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson. "Happy, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Very," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though it still feels like a dream sometimes." "If it is, I don't want to wake," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Nora turned in his arms to face him. "I never imagined this life for myself. After all that happened, my father, the attack, running for our lives, I never thought I'd find such happiness." "We earned it," Bryce said simply, "both of us." "Yes," she agreed. "We did." She hesitated, then added, "And I think we might have even more happiness coming our way soon." Bryce looked at her questioningly. "I'm fairly certain," Nora said, a smile playing at her lips, "that in about 7 months our family will be growing by one." Understanding dawned in Bryce's eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took her breath away. He lifted her gently, spinning her in a circle before setting her carefully back on her feet. "A baby," he whispered, his hand resting reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Our future," Nora corrected, covering his hand with her own. Over the next years, that future unfolded in ways both expected and surprising. Their son, James, named for Bryce's fallen brother, arrived on a stormy July night in 1886, a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Margaret, a lively child whose laughter filled their home with joy. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Bryce's natural skill with cattle combined with Nora's shrewd business sense made them a formidable team. They expanded their holdings gradually, acquiring adjacent land when it became available, building a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Ellie grew into a beautiful young woman with a passion for education. With Bryce and Nora's blessing and financial support, she attended a women's college in California, returning with a teaching certificate and dreams of starting a proper school in their growing community. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought years tested their resilience. A bout of cattle fever nearly wiped out their herd in '89. And there were times when memories of the violence they'd endured returned in nightmares that left them both shaken and clinging to each other in the darkness. But through it all, the promise Bryce had made that day in the ravine held true. He protected them not just with his strength and courage, but with his unwavering love and commitment to the family they'd built together. On a warm evening in the summer of 1895, 10 years after their paths had first crossed, Nora sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Bryce taught 7-year-old James to rope a practice dummy in the yard. Little Margaret, not to be outdone, insisted on trying too, her pigtails bouncing as she swung the small rope her father had made especially for her. Ellie emerged from the house, a letter in her hand and excitement on her face. "The town council approved my proposal," she announced. "We'll break ground on the new schoolhouse next month." "That's wonderful news," Nora exclaimed, making room on the porch swing for her sister. At 26, Ellie had grown into a confident, capable woman, respected throughout the county for her dedication to education. "I couldn't have done it without your support," Ellie said, squeezing Nora's hand. "Both of you." "Family supports family," Nora replied simply. It was the cornerstone of their lives, the principle that guided everything they did. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Bryce called the children in for supper. They raced toward the house, James crowing about his successful throws while Margaret insisted hers had been better. Bryce followed at a more measured pace, his smile warming as he caught sight of Nora and Ellie on the porch. At 40, he was still strong and vital, though silver had begun to thread through his dark hair at the temples. "Successful lesson?" Nora asked as he climbed the steps. "They're naturals," he confirmed, pride evident in his voice. "Though I fear our daughter may be too bold for her own good." "Can't imagine where she gets that from," Nora teased, accepting the kiss he dropped on her upturned lips. "Her mother, without question," Bryce replied with mock seriousness. "I am the very model of caution and restraint." Ellie's unladylike snort of laughter made them all chuckle. Later that night, with the children asleep and Ellie retired to her room, Nora and Bryce stood together on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. His arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting atop her head in a familiar, comfortable embrace. 10 years, he mused quietly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday I found you in that ravine. And sometimes it feels like we've always been together," Nora added, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question he posed each year on the anniversary of that fateful day. And as she did each year, Nora turned in his arms to face him, her hands framing his beloved face. "Not one," she assured him. "Every step led us here, to this life we've built. How could I regret any of it?" Bryce's eyes, still as blue and clear as the day they'd met, searched hers. "I made you a promise that day. And you've kept it," Nora said softly. "Every day since. And I always will," he vowed, bending to capture her lips in a kiss that, even after a decade together, still held the power to make her heart race and her soul soar. In that moment, under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by the home and family they'd created from the ashes of tragedy, Nora knew with absolute certainty that some promises were meant to last a lifetime and beyond.